When Clint Eastwood strolled past a busy art stand on a city sidewalk, most people didn't even notice him. Just another passerby, just another face in the crowd. But when he stopped, picked up a painting, and quietly listened to the girl in front of the stand, everything changed. Because this wasn't just any artist, Sophie Carter was fighting for more than just recognition. She was painting to save her own life. And what happened next became an unforgettable moment. Because in true Clint Eastwood style, he didn't just buy a painting, he changed her future forever. It was a dim, sterile room where the fluorescent lights above hummed softly, casting a pale glow over the white walls. The smell of antiseptic clung to the air, mixing with the faint beeping of monitors from the next room. Sophie Carter sat on the crinkled hospital bed, her hands curled into tight fists in her lap. Across from her, Dr. Patel adjusted his glasses, his expression carefully neutral. Sophie already knew what was coming. She had heard this tone before, gentle, practiced, the kind doctors used when they were about to deliver bad news. "The treatment is working," he said, a small glimmer of hope in his voice, "but you'll need at least 2 more rounds of chemo." Sophie barely flinched. She was used to this routine, the pain, the sickness, the exhaustion. It had become part of her life now. What she wasn't used to was what he said next. "I understand your family is struggling with the costs. Unfortunately, without insurance coverage for the next round, the out-of-pocket expenses will be—" He hesitated, then sighed. "Substantial." Her mother let out a shaky breath beside her. Sophie didn't need to look at her to know she was fighting back tears. The medical bills had already drained them dry. Their savings were gone. The last round of treatments had pushed them to the edge, and now this? For the first time in a long time, fear crept into Sophie's chest, not of dying, but of watching her parents lose everything trying to save her. The drive home was silent. Her mother gripped the steering wheel so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Her father's voice had been hoarse when he told her everything would be okay, but Sophie could hear the lie in it. That night, lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling, heart pounding. She refused to be a burden. She refused to let her parents drown in debt because of her. And that's when it hit her. Article, it had always been her escape, her passion. If she could create something that mattered, something people wanted to buy, maybe she could fight back in her own way. By morning, Sophie had made up her mind. She wasn't going to wait for a miracle. She was going to make one. The first stroke of paint always felt like magic. The brush glided over the canvas, leaving behind soft blues and bold strokes of orange, the colors bleeding together to form something new, something alive. Sophie sat on a foldable stool, her art stand set up on a bustling downtown sidewalk. The small wooden table in front of her was covered in neatly arranged canvases, each one a piece of her soul. Her mother had helped her set up the stand that morning, but the rest was up to Sophie. It had been her idea, after all. She had spent the last week pouring every ounce of energy into her paintings, knowing this wasn't just about art anymore. It was about survival. If she could sell enough, if people saw value in what she created, maybe, just maybe, she could afford the treatment that could save her life. But hope was a fragile thing. Pedestrians walked by, some glancing her way, others barely noticing. A woman in a navy blazer slowed for a second, admiring a canvas before shaking her head and moving on. A man in sunglasses and a tailored suit stopped long enough to read the small handwritten sign in front of her booth, "Original Art, Funding My Cancer Treatment." His mouth pressed into a tight line. Then he turned and walked away. Sophie exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the table to steady herself. The heat of the afternoon pressed down on her, making her dizzy. It had been hours, and she hadn't sold a single piece. She reached for her water bottle, hands trembling slightly as she took a sip. Fatigue gnawed at her bones, a cruel reminder of what she was up against, not just the world, but her own body. But giving up? Not an option. She forced a smile as an elderly couple approached, the woman's eyes bright with curiosity. "These are beautiful," she murmured, running her fingers lightly over the edge of a canvas. It was a piece Sophie had poured her heart into, a vast desert sky, painted in deep purples and streaks of gold. "How much for this one?" Sophie swallowed. $80? The woman shared a glance with her husband, who nodded. "We'll take it." For a second, Sophie didn't move. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind, but now that it was happening, she felt frozen. Then, as the woman handed her the cash, something inside Sophie cracked open. The first sale, her first victory. She held on to that feeling as she packed the painting into a paper bag. The couple walked away, leaving Sophie with $80 and a renewed sense of purpose. Maybe she was just one girl selling art on a street corner, but she was fighting, and she wasn't done yet. The city was alive. Street musicians strummed guitars on the corners, their melodies blending with the distant hum of traffic. Tourists wandered past, snapping photos of murals painted on the sides of old brick buildings. Businessmen, glued to their phones, brushed by without a second glance. Sophie sat at her small table, hands resting on her knees, watching the world move around her. It was strange, really, being surrounded by so many people, yet feeling invisible. She had sold one painting so far. One. Every time she saw someone glance her way, hope flared in her chest. Maybe this time, maybe this person would stop, admire her work, see her not as a girl begging for charity, but as an artist. Most didn't. Some slowed their pace, their eyes flicking to the canvases before walking on. Others barely noticed her at all. And then there were the ones who did stop, but only to offer pity, not support. A middle-aged woman in a floral dress sighed as she read Sophie's sign. "Oh, honey," she murmured, voice thick with sympathy. "I wish I could help, but I just don't have the money." Sophie smiled politely. "That's okay. Thank you for stopping." The woman lingered, her gaze heavy. "You poor thing, you must be so brave." Brave. That word again. She had heard it so many times since her diagnosis, but it never felt right. She wasn't brave. She was desperate. She was tired. Still, she nodded, let the woman offer her soft words, then watched her walk away, just like the others. Not long after, a different kind of customer showed up. A man in a leather jacket, sunglasses perched on his head, sauntered up to her stand. He eyed the paintings for a moment before letting out a low, amused scoff. "Nobody buys real art anymore, kid," he muttered. "You should try selling prints, or I don't know, TikTok commissions." Sophie's hands clenched into fists. She bit back the sharp response on the tip of her tongue, swallowing the anger that burned at the back of her throat. She had dealt with people like this before, people who didn't understand, who thought dreams weren't worth chasing. "I don't need your advice," she said simply. "I just need to fight." The man snorted but didn't argue. He walked away, blending into the crowd. Sophie let out a slow breath. She refused to let frustration win. Because somewhere in this city, maybe today, maybe tomorrow, someone would see her, and that would change everything. By the fourth day, Sophie was exhausted. Her body ached from sitting on the hard metal stool, her muscles weak from chemo treatments. The summer heat pressed against her skin, making her dizzy. She had sold 3 paintings in total. It wasn't enough, not even close. She tried to stay optimistic, but the weight of reality was creeping in. Maybe the man in the leather jacket was right. Maybe no one cared. And then, out of nowhere, someone stopped. Not just any customer, a journalist. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, carrying a notebook and a press badge clipped to her bag. Her dark brown hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and her eyes lit up as she took in Sophie's stand. "This is beautiful," she said, gesturing toward a canvas of a twilight cityscape. "Did you paint all of these yourself?" Sophie blinked, nodding slowly. "Yeah." The journalist smiled, pulling out her phone. "I run a small online arts blog. I love finding hidden talent in the city. Mind if I take a few photos?" Sophie hesitated. "Wait, really? Really? For the next few minutes, the woman took pictures of the paintings, of Sophie sitting at her stand, of the small handwritten sign explaining why she was selling them. Then she asked the question Sophie wasn't expecting. "What's your story?" So Sophie told her about the hospital visits, about the medical bills piling up, about how she refused to let her parents struggle alone. The journalist nodded thoughtfully, jotting notes in the corner of her notebook. "People should hear this," she said. "I'll make sure they do." Sophie didn't think much of it. People made promises all the time. But the next morning when she arrived at her stand, something was different. More people were stopping, not just to look, but to buy. A woman bought 2 paintings in a row. A young couple flipped through her canvases, debating which one to take home. By noon, she had sold more paintings than she had in the last 4 days combined. Then her phone buzzed. It was a message from Lucas, her best friend. "Dude, check this out." She clicked the link. It was an article, her article. "Fighting for art, fighting for life, the teen who's painting her way to chemo." And at the bottom, thousands of shares. Sophie's heart pounded. This was real. But even then, she didn't know just how big this moment was about to become. Because her biggest customer yet? He was already on his way. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the sidewalk, stretching past Sophie's stand as another wave of pedestrians rushed by. The city was a blur of movement, people lost in their own worlds, their own problems, their own distractions. Sophie wiped the sweat from her forehead, trying to ignore the dizziness creeping in. Her body was screaming at her to rest, but rest wouldn't pay for chemo. She exhaled, adjusting the small stack of paintings on her table. The feature in the arts blog had helped. Sales were picking up, but she was still far from her goal. And then, without warning, the energy around her shifted. A quiet presence, a stillness that felt out of place amid the city's chaos. She felt it before she saw him. A tall, older man had stopped at her stand. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't glancing at his phone, wasn't rushing to his next meeting. He stood completely still, hands tucked into the pockets of a weathered leather jacket, a cowboy hat tilted low over his face. He was studying her paintings, not just looking, but really seeing. Sophie barely paid him any mind at first. She had seen all kinds of customers, curious tourists, skeptical businessmen, distracted shoppers who pretended to be interested only to walk away. But this guy? Something about him was different. She was too tired to place why. "See anything you like?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the long day. The man smirked, just a little, just enough for her to notice. "Depends," he said, his voice gravelly, slow, unmistakably familiar. "What's the story behind these?" Sophie hesitated. Most people asked about the prices, not the story. She glanced at him again, properly this time. His face was lined with age, but his piercing blue eyes held something sharp, something steady, like they had seen 100 lifetimes and still weren't easily impressed. Something about him felt like an old Western come to life. She cleared her throat. "I paint because I have to," she said simply. "It's the only thing I can control right now." He didn't blink. He just waited, letting the silence do the work. So she told him. About the diagnosis, about the ticking clock the doctors had given her, about how every brushstroke, every sale, wasn't just about survival, it was about taking back her life. And when she finished, the man didn't offer sympathy. He just nodded, and then he reached for a painting. The man lifted a black and white canvas from the table, tilting it slightly in the light. It was one of Sophie's favorites, a vast desert landscape, the silhouette of a lone cowboy standing in the distance. The contrast between light and shadow, the endless sky above, it had taken her weeks to perfect. The man studied it carefully. Then, with a slow nod, he spoke. "I'll take this one." Sophie barely reacted at first. She had done this a dozen times before, customers picking a piece, handing over cash, walking away without a second thought. She swallowed, running a hand through the back of her short-cropped hair. Okay, it's $200. The man didn't even reach for his wallet. Instead, he pulled out a checkbook. Sophie blinked, thrown off by the unexpected gesture. No one carried checkbooks anymore. She watched as he uncapped a pen, his movements slow, deliberate. He scribbled something down, tore the check from the book, and handed it to her. She took it hesitantly, her fingers barely gripping the paper. And then she saw the number. Her breath caught in her throat. Her vision blurred at the edges as her eyes locked onto the check, onto the impossible amount written in neat, bold handwriting. Not $200, $50,000. Her hands started to shake. "This," she whispered, barely able to form words, "this can't be right." The man smirked, tilting his hat back slightly, finally revealing his face fully. Sophie's heart stopped. Clint Eastwood, the legend, the icon, the man whose films her dad had made her watch growing up, the man whose stare alone had defined generations of cinema. And here he was, standing in front of her, buying her art. No, changing her life. She couldn't breathe. She started, shaking her head in disbelief. I can't take this." Clint's eyes didn't waver. "It's not charity," he said. "It's a damn good painting." Sophie felt like the ground beneath her had disappeared. People were staring now. The few pedestrians nearby had taken notice, their whispers growing louder. Someone pulled out a phone, snapping a picture. But Sophie didn't care about the crowd. She looked at Clint, really looked at him, and saw something deeper in his expression. A quiet understanding. He knew what it meant to fight for something. He had spent his life doing it. And now, in the middle of a busy street, he had just given her a chance to keep fighting too. Her hands clenched around the check. For the first time in a long time, Sophie felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. And the craziest part? This was only the beginning. Sophie's world tilted. She stared at the check in her trembling hands, her mind struggling to catch up with what she was seeing. Not $200, not $2,000, $50,000. Her breath hitched, her fingers tightening around the paper like it might slip away if she didn't hold on. The city noise faded, the rush of pedestrians, the distant honking of cars, the hum of street musicians, it all blurred into a dull, meaningless hum. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. She forced herself to blink, to look again, convinced that she had read the number wrong. But there it was, clear as day. $50,000. Her stomach flipped, her pulse thundered in her ears. "This," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of it. "This must be a mistake." She looked up at the man, the cowboy in the leather jacket, the one who had spent the last few minutes casually flipping through her paintings like he had all the time in the world. And now, standing under the glare of the afternoon sun, she saw him for the first time. The sharp blue eyes, the familiar smirk, the quiet confidence of a man who had spent a lifetime unshaken by the world around him. Her breath caught. Clint Eastwood, the legend himself. The realization hit her like a freight train. Her father's favorite actor, the man whose movies had played in her living room every weekend growing up. The Hollywood icon who didn't just play tough guys on screen, he was one in real life. And now, he was standing in front of her, handing her a check that could change everything. He watched her carefully, reading the shock on her face. Then he smirked. "No mistake, kid." His voice was low, steady. "You just keep painting." Sophie swallowed hard. Her legs felt like they might give out. She opened her mouth, trying to form words. "Thank you. Why are you doing this? I don't deserve this." But nothing came out. Because nothing in her life had ever prepared her for this moment. And it wasn't over yet. At first, no one noticed. The city moved on as it always did. Fast, distracted, unaware of the history unfolding right here on the sidewalk. Then, the first whisper. Someone, a teenage boy with earbuds jammed into his ears, stopped mid-step, his head tilting as he stared at Clint. His eyes widened. "Wait," he muttered, his voice uncertain but growing louder. "Is that Clint Eastwood?" A woman nearby turned, her phone half raised. She squinted, her gaze flicking between Sophie's stand and the man in the worn-out cowboy hat. Then a second whisper, then a third. Then it happened. A flurry of movement, people stopping in their tracks, heads whipping around, conversations halting. Someone gasped. Another person snapped a photo, and just like that, the quiet afternoon turned into a frenzy. The whispers turned into shouts. "Oh my God, it's really him. Clint Eastwood is here, right here on this sidewalk. Why is he... Wait, is he buying a painting? What's going on?" Phones shot up in every direction. A group of college students rushed closer, their voices filled with disbelief. A businesswoman in high heels nearly tripped as she backtracked, pulling her assistant along with her. Then the tipping point. A man in a suit, someone who had walked past Sophie's stand earlier without a second glance, turned back around. "What's happening?" he asked, stepping closer. He looked at Clint, then at Sophie, then at the stack of paintings. His eyes darted to the check still clutched in her shaking hands. He saw the number. His jaw dropped. "Wait, he just bought a painting?" he blurted out. Another woman gasped. "For $50,000? That was it." The crowd exploded. People swarmed Sophie's stand, their eyes darting between her and Clint, trying to make sense of what they were witnessing. And then the wildest thing happened. Someone reached for a painting. "I'll take this one." A man in a blue polo shirt called out, grabbing a cityscape painting and pulling out his wallet. Before Sophie could even process that sale, another hand shot forward. "And this one, how much is it?" a woman asked hurriedly, flipping through the remaining pieces. Within minutes, the paintings that had been ignored for days were being snatched up one by one. People didn't even haggle. They didn't ask questions. They just bought. A teenage girl pulled out her phone and turned to her mom. "I need cash. Now. I want one before they're gone." Sophie sat there, stunned, as her once quiet booth transformed into the hottest attraction in the city. It was insane. And Clint? Clint just stood there, calm as ever, hands in his pockets, watching it all unfold. Finally, he leaned in slightly and muttered just loud enough for Sophie to hear, "Told you, kid, just keep painting." And with that, he tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Sophie to watch the scene around her erupt into something she never could have imagined. And the craziest part, this wasn't even the end. This was just the beginning. By the time Sophie got home that night, her phone was on fire. Notifications flooded her screen, the constant ping, ping, ping of messages and alerts making her head spin. At first, she thought something was wrong. Then she saw the headlines. Clint Eastwood buys teen's painting for $50,000, and you won't believe why. Hollywood legend helps young artist battling cancer in the most unbelievable way. Teen's art stand becomes the talk of the nation after a surprise visit from Clint Eastwood. Her photo was everywhere. A single image, Clint Eastwood standing at her tiny art booth, holding the black and white Western painting, was now plastered across news sites, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. The video someone had taken of the moment he handed her the check? Over 3 million views. Sophie couldn't breathe. Her best friend Lucas called first. "Sophie, you are literally everywhere." I don't even know what's happening," she whispered, staring at the endless wave of comments. Then the messages started coming in. Not just from strangers, from buyers. People from all over the country, all over the world, wanted her paintings. "Hi, Sophie. I'd love to buy a piece of your work. Do you ship to Texas? Your story inspired me so much. I'd like to commission a painting. Any price, just name it. My daughter is also fighting cancer. Your strength gives us hope. I'd love to buy something to support you." Sophie's hands shook. She scrolled, heart pounding. Dozens of messages turned into hundreds. Then thousands. Orders, donations, requests for interviews. Then the email that stopped her cold. Subject: Gallery Inquiry. She clicked on it with trembling fingers. A prestigious gallery owner in New York wanted to represent her. Sophie, your story is remarkable. We'd love to showcase your work in our upcoming exhibition. Let's talk. Sophie pressed a hand against her chest, feeling her heart hammer against her ribs. This was real. She wasn't just selling paintings anymore. She had become a symbol of resilience. 1 month later, Sophie walked into the hospital for her final round of treatment. Paid in full, every bill, every debt, every crushing financial burden that had once threatened her future. Gone. Because of one painting, because of one moment, because a man in a cowboy hat had stopped, listened, and believed in her. The chemo was rough, but this time she wasn't scared, because outside of that hospital room, she had a future waiting for her. A week after her final treatment, she received a letter, handwritten, from Clint Eastwood. She opened it carefully, her fingers shaking. Sophie, your fight reminds me why some stories still matter. Never stop telling yours. Clint. Tears welled in her eyes. She folded the letter carefully, pressing it to her chest. Then, later that night, she picked up a brush and started to paint. Her first official gallery show was set for the next month. Her inbox was flooded with commission requests. Her career was just beginning. But there was one painting she would never sell. The first one she had ever sold, the black and white Western landscape. It now hung in Clint Eastwood's private collection. A reminder that true grit, it isn't just in Westerns. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.